You already know I've got 3 4G63 builds going on right now, and the pre-machining state of 2 of these blocks are currently unknown because at least one of them needs a crankshaft. That corrugated container houses the GSX 7-bolt build groceries, but let's start with this Galant block first. Right here we got a 6-bolt that belongs to the Galant, and in this drawer we have the crankshaft, and I want to see if these bearings make that crankshaft fit that block. Might as well just glove up and get right to it. Here's the soft factory bearing selection of what was in it. These are not ACL raced, they're just basically standard bearings. Let's see, are they, we don't need them, but are they oversized? Let's see. If anyone should, I feel like I should know what A17X is. The other letters, OG0, don't give me any useful info to work with either. If you're OG number 0, I mean, that would make you iced tea. So I called him, and he said he ain't got nothing to do with it. So I searched the internet. I don't know if you feel the same as me, but search engines don't seem to work anymore. And I know that many of you probably agree here. Anyway, no thrust bearing should ever look like this. Don't ever see a shiny ground off flat spot on both sides of the thrust main and pretend that that's normal. It isn't. It's really strange how the thrust surface is fine on both sides, but the journal isn't. If they were replaced after the timing belt incident took place, then these bearings should only be about 20 to 40,000 miles old. They look way too hammered and beat up to me to be anything that was in here for that short of a period of time. It's not likely at all that the previous owner neglected this car because if anything, I know he exceeded its maintenance schedule. This separation of the bearing material comes from oil starvation. Based off the thrust bearing damage, the oil starvation damage, the valve prints in all 4 of the pistons, and the timing sprocket pulley damage that we saw, I'm 99% sure that all this wear is from that previous incident. That thrust bearing journal wear occurred when the timing belt snapped and the valve train stopped the crankshaft in the car. We all saw the cylinder head and the valve guides. We know that happened. But what I continue to find are markings that don't match on any of the other bearing shells. All of them were different. So with the lack of examples of replacement part numbers lining up with any of these bearings, I'm just going to assume that DSMers were never concerned enough about the factory bearings to talk about them. Only 2 people have ever asked and nobody ever answered their particular question. Apparently all DSMers just went straight for proven upgrades without ever looking back. And that's pretty much exactly what I'm going to do too. This spare set of standard ACL race bearings should give me a baseline of what I'm working with as far as a crankshaft is concerned. Hopefully. None of this stuff that I'm doing right now hasn't been covered here before. I'm just going to do a quick plastic gauge test to see whose ballpark we're playing inside of first. I'm not giving it the full Jaffro cleaning job yet, and this isn't assembly. I'm just trying to see if it's a viable candidate to receive the rest of the $3,500 pile of rebuild parts that I've already stockpiled for it. The crank's already ultrasonic washed and meticulously cleaned, but I'm giving her the old shoestring treatment just to be thorough. It's a great dollar store toolbox find. Compressed air is also your best friend too here. I've got new ARP main bolts for this build. 6-bolt factory main bolts are reusable, and so are ARPs, but these were a kind of while you're in there based preventative maintenance combined with my knowledge of boost junkie theory and genetics. It told me I kind of had to do it, so I did it. Yeah, the torque load on these are considerably more stout. The 10mm ARPs get a 20, 40, 60 torque sequence, and I'm really putting a lot of faith into this little crankshaft here because pretty much everything else I've found above its center line has been used all the way up. Factory spec is 2 to 5/100ths of a millimeter, or 8 to 20/10,000ths of an inch. That's what the service manual says to use for a stock build, but I prefer 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 on a performance build that sees street use with forged parts. So if I could be anywhere in that range, I'll be happy. This Galant isn't supposed to be my drag chassis. I want to drive it on the street and for a long time. That's the goal anyway. As I gave the rest of it a once-over, I lost my patience with moving the camera to show you what I found before just ripping all these bearings right out of the parts and purging them from my life. I really didn't like what I saw, and these had touched the GSX block before. Though they'd never been used in a running engine, they've been in and out of other engines and dozens of journals dozens of times I was using them, so I didn't mark up a brand new set. I wanted to dispel any chance that they're cursed though, and I believe they might be, so they're banished, excommunicated. Let me show you what happened. I got 4 thousandths. Not on one, but possibly 2 main journals. 4 thousandths is the service limit. 4 thousandths is a tenth of a millimeter. All the rest of them were 3 to 3.5 thousandths, and you'll be able to see that one go by. And I bumped the crank on number 3, but the print on both the crank and the part off camera looked like 4 thousandths to me. That was the straw that broke Jaffro's back a minute ago. It's possible that I can send this one for only 3 thousandths, but as loose as that is, with forged parts and balance shafts, oil squirters, the center section to feed, and everything else, I just really don't like it being 3 thousandths. Not for the sake of my oil pressure. This would be the kind of build that you full send with deleted balance shafts, like the Hyundais, to see how far it goes. That's not what I'm trying to build here. Some people would argue with me that this is the sweet spot. Yeah, well, I want a milder daily driver built out of this sedan with balance shafts, air conditioning, and plenty of potential. This one is going to remain a TDO 5H turbo, and I'm 100% positive about that. I don't need the RPMs that benefit from an oil clearance like that. Enough said. When I was up really close measuring the block, it was really quiet, and I heard it say, "Get these bearings out of me," so I got a brand new set. But this time it's different. As it's past set in and I had time to think about it, I wanted to pull all the stops out and go over the main cap surfaces on both suitcase handles and the block with a razor blade, because you saw how the main bearing cap got hammered really badly. A vertical razor blade is straight on the edge and it's not going to remove any metal. It's just going to clean away the rust and scale and funk. So you're safe to do this on both sides of the surface, clean them up. What good was my intel if I left this to chance like I did with the first round of bearings? So that's why I'm doing this and getting a new set. And that's just the thing. You're going to screw stuff up sometimes. It adds time and expense in most cases, but it doesn't today outside of that example. It might help you find one or both of the things that went wrong, so don't ever be upset about the things that don't go your way. I thoroughly enjoyed destroying that box of bearings on my bike. They deserved it. We'll see if this next test changes anything for me, and I hope so, but we'll skip a lot of it. You don't need to see all that again, just what I did differently and really should have done the first time around. I included that scene because I knew that even though I fouled that test, I know there was some truth to it. And everything you just saw me do are the steps you'd take to resolve that and rule it out. Since this crank bent 12 out of 16 valves, there can be many things wrong with it that I can't test for at all in my home garage. Naturally, I'm going to need a second opinion and some advice on how to fix all of this, but what I learned from this test will help me be prepared for everything that my machinist might need from me the moment when I show up. This engine is at least 32 years old. It's got 158,000 miles on it. I ran 1270s at the drag strip on this crank at the behest of its owner about 2 decades ago, and that was after it took the timing belt beating and repairs. It wasn't its only trip to the drag strip either. By no means am I expecting it to meet factory spec, but it looks to me like I did everything right this time and confirmed what I suspected from the first test. Every single last one of these journals is measuring out at 3 thousandths even on the precision estimator tab. If anything, really, it looks like the center main that I didn't bump while removing this time is actually just a tad under 3 thousandths. There, you see that? It's smack in the middle between the widest factory spec and the service limit, or the end of its life. It could be the fault of the crank, or the hole, or both. Place your bets. It's easy to understand that the spot between spec and the service limit is the declining oil pressure region and stage of an engine's life with a factory oil pump. It's a faster decline than the first half of all that wear that got us to this point. This part can be controversial. It's the cheapest new billet 88mm 6-bolt crankshaft available for the 4G63, because it's the only new 88mm crankshaft available for a 6-bolt 4G63, off anyone's part shelves. There's mixed reviews about these things. Most of the 4G63 stories are positive. And, really, what choice does a standard stroke 6-bolt 4G63 engine owner have anyway? I don't care about anything but specs and test results, so I'm going to hold my opinion of it. I'm going to treat this like any other unbalanced, unfinished crankshaft. This Eagle 4340 forged crankshaft adds the expense of a new part to whatever project it's going to end up on, but it costs half as much as everyone else's 7-bolt crank. So I think the expense of testing, balancing, and finishing it is well justified. I think this is a good move for my goals to have this, in case I have a problem with the crankshaft of any of my projects. One thing I can't help but notice, though, there's no grinding, no drilling, and therefore no evidence of balancing done on one whole side of this crankshaft, not even left to right. On a factory DSM crankshaft, the balancing is typically done on just about every single one of the counterweights and across them. It could be fine, and we'll see how this turns out. This is just an important thing to observe whenever you get a new crankshaft. I'm going to measure all the journals of both of these 6-bolt cranks, but I'm not really concerned with inspecting the rods or the pistons for this build because I already have the required bearings and all of those parts are going to have to be fitted by my machinist anyway. The mains on this Eagle crank are all fine. I mean, there's certainly no meat on those bones, but I'm really disappointed in the number 1 rod journal for a fresh out of the box crankshaft. It's better to come up short there on number 1 than it is on number 4, I suppose, though. You see here, the Eagle forged 4340 crank is 35 pounds even. The factory crankshaft is 35.4 pounds. Yes, I know you're curious about the butcher crank for the GSX. It's 28.8 pounds. It's got 6.5 pounds shaved off it.
How do you like them apples?
Here's a close-up of both sides of the balancing work that was performed on the Eagle crankshaft. Note how it differs from the factory one next. I didn't buy this crank because I have to use it on this build. I bought it because I have 4 32-year-old 6-bolt 4G63 engine blocks in my driveway or garage, with an 88mm stroke crankshaft and no spares. 3 of them are prepped for surgery right now, and if any of my engines have a crankshaft problem at any time, especially while they're at the machine shop, or if it turns out to be a better candidate than any of the ones I already have, then I don't want it removed from the operating table to be set aside waiting for organs to arrive. We know what I've already been through with the GSX, and we know that this engine already went through a whole lot with its own valve train and rotating assembly. All the shafts and all of the holes on this thing took a beating. Alright, so I'm done with the Eagle example. I'm putting it away. I'm going to clean up this well-used factory crankshaft that once ate a valve train and then went on for another 40,000 more miles with upgrades, just to see how it measures up to the fresh out of the box 6-bolt Eagle forged crankshaft. I'm just going to get this plastic gauge off of here first and then measure all 9 bearing journals. I'm not going to do anything fancy to figure it out, but I'm going to go to plaid for a second. There. What you can walk away with in this example is that Mitsubishi built one of the toughest factory crankshafts you're ever going to find in a gasoline burner. Every journal is in spec 32 years later despite every bit of punishment this thing's endured. In fact, there's more meat on it than even the Eagle unit. Of course, it's in need of a polish job, which is going to shave a 1/10 or 2 off all these numbers, but my machinist won't have any problems fitting all of my new rods and pistons to this factory crank, because it's in spec. But what all this tells me is, the main bore was elongated during that impact. You saw how it pinched the thrust main bearing together on its parting line and polished its edges off. She kept on ticking too. So that's what I'll be warning him about on this repair. I'll let him know that I want to use the factory crank, but there's an extra Eagle crankshaft in the box just in case things don't work out. I'm going to tell him that I'm shooting for between 2 and 2 1/4 thousandths on all of my oil clearances. They really don't need to hear much else from me aside from that. They just need my rods, bearings, pistons, fasteners, and knowing what I know about all of this in advance helps me to accept whatever they wind up discovering that I could have missed. Initially, I didn't want to do this because this electronic gauge is such a pain in the butt to zero compared to a mechanical one, but curiosity's got the best of me right now. So I'm just setting the bore gauge up to give us the oil clearance. Basically the same number as the plastic gauge gave us, but a far more specific one. Magically the bearings are installed and all the caps are torqued down.
What I got was 28.
On the outer edge of the journal I got 28.5 10,000ths of an inch. Here I've got 31.5 tenths minus 28.5 tenths, that's 3 10,000ths of an inch of run out across the number 1 main bearing journal. I want to see a whole lot more of this, all these other journals, but I really can't do that with it on the engine stand. The shop doing the work wants everything removed from the block, so I'm pulling the balance shaft plugs, the engine mount stud, the freeze plugs, or the core plugs, what have you. Those are a lot of fun. Everyone's got their own way to do this. Old people with a budget find an excuse to use an air tool that makes it as hard as pulling a trigger to knock them loose, and then you yank them out with some pliers. You can use an extension and a big hammer and a punch, a chisel, a drill with a teeny tiny drill bit, and make a little hole and screw the attachment for a slide hammer in there, and you can make this as complicated as you want. And I can just be lazy here. The air chisel works great until it doesn't. The transmission side plugs decided they want to ignore all of my intentions and go do their own thing. Alright, fine. Hammer and chisel method for me then, I guess. All I do in cases like this is drive the leading edge of the core plug diagonally in an effort to try to get the opposite side to pop out. Edge of the chisel against the edge of the plug, and when I get enough visible to grab it with pliers, it's done. Sometimes they put up a bigger fight though, and if you can't get it to a place where you can grab it with pliers, then make one. I managed to make a gap big enough to fit the chisel in there and bend the crap out of it to make a thing to grab onto. Bye bye main oil galley plug. There's thread locking sealant on this plug. Never use air tools on this thing for any reason. Get it hot to release the sealant, the right size Allen head socket, and a wrench, or else don't do this at all. Somewhere in my video pile I do all of this wrong and I pay the price for my own stupidity. We got a little sidetracked there, sorry. I took this thing off the stand mainly because I wanted to check out all the mains and provide you with an example of the modern hieroglyphics of my people. There's a cool example in this that's very easy to see. Just like thousands of other times in human history, examples have been left behind to remind future generations that their predecessors were a whole lot smarter than they were. I'm going to quickly show you and explain what all these markings mean. These drawings are upside down with the mains facing up. The intake and exhaust sides are marked on each glyph. I've got the angle of the dial bore gauge marked, and I've taken measurements at the 90 degrees and at 45s from the parting lines of the caps. There are two measurements to indicate run out, and the top measurements are facing the timing side, the bottom measurements are on the flywheel side. If there's only one number, it's because both measurements matched. What you can immediately see in this layout is that there's a fat side and a skinny side to the hole on every single journal. Notice how the exhaust side of every single hole is the fat part of the hole. What this is demonstrating is thrust angle wear. A 4G63 spins clockwise, so the crank is rotating across the intake side of the block as the combustion events apply the greatest forces on the crankshaft. Opposite of that center line is the exhaust side of the bearing journal. So what all these numbers demonstrate with brand new bearings is that the main journal is a bit egg-shaped to one side just from wear. And what this means for me, with the parts stockpile that's going into it, it's likely going to see the same work that the GSX's 6-bolt requires in order to correct it. Only it's not going to require billet mains and a bearing girdle. One other thing I meant to do was pull the balance shaft bearings out of it and get a look at what's up with those. I don't know with any certainty whatsoever what caused, the first timing belt to fail in this thing. I'm not sure that anybody does, but the bottom end obviously didn't receive any work, and I don't think these are going to be any different because there's risk involved with servicing a balance shaft bearing. We've got MD 998374-01, which is the plate that bolts around the oil pump shaft hole with a pair of M8 by 20 bolts. And also the MIT 304204, which is a threaded rod with a 22mm nut and a hinged foot on the other end that fits through the bearing hole. And then you fold it out and it grabs the bearing by its edges. You snug the nut down and the washer centers it into the beveled hole. Just start cranking the nut until the bearing breaks loose. Continue tightening the nut and it pulls the bearing straight out of the hole. Much less destructive method using the right tool compared to another video here on my channel for people deleting the balance shafts. Yeah, this bearing's done. Well done. Bearings should not audibly fail fingernail tests. I'm going to keep my balance shafts in place. I have all the right tools to do it right, only I can't find one of them at the moment to do the other shaft, so let's not wait. Let's move on to the GSX's 7-bolt build. That block only spun rod bearings. It should be a lot easier. This is an expensive box. It's from Italy, as you can tell. It's a good thing that I have all the parts for the Galant, but that 7-bolt was pretty cooked, so naturally that rotating assembly kind of needed to be replaced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut into this box and get it out of the way. There's a whole lot of cool stuff in here, and then I'll go over everything that's in it. Where to start? Little boxes, you know what these are. Yeah. Big box? No. Let's start with a little one. You know, I have to do it in this order. I'm going to shut my live self up for a minute and just go ahead and explain all this. Whether I use a 6-bolt or a 7-bolt engine block in my GSX, these Torque Solutions engine mounts are going to work for me. The front and rear roll stopper mounts for a 2nd generation car attached to the transmission, and I made modifications to my timing side mount so that the 7-bolt mount bracket fits my 6-bolt block. It's a 2-piece mount, and the top half would be the same. That's why, for me, these mounts fit either one. They're designed to withstand greater torque loads, and their poly bushings are going to allow for less deflection in the drivetrain, thus helping me translate throttle pedal into chassis propulsion a whole lot quicker. But not only are they going to help my car perform better, they're going to look amazing while doing it. It's a $600 solution to a problem I can't even prove I had. I already have 4 mounts, and they're perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with any of them. I even have the energy suspension bushing kit, and I could have kept using the inserts that I was already using, but this is what I did instead. The 6-bolt GSX block used Manly turbo-tough I-beam rods with a 22mm wrist pin. So you know what? We got a set of Manly turbo-tough I-beam rods for a 7-bolt with a 22mm wrist pin hole as well. Might as well keep things consistent, right? I've also got the recommended bearings right here, as suggested on the packaging. Being prepared. 4B1185H standards. There you go. We've all seen the discussion where these are rated for 1,000 plus question mark. Who knows? They can basically take all of it, but I'm only going to be using some of it. These are beefy units, and they weigh slightly less than the factory 6-bolt rods do. I'll prove that later. You want to know what's in the big box, so let's not keep you waiting here. There's already been so much foreshadowing in this video, I think it's really obvious what it is right now. Yes, it is. It's a Manly Turbo Tough 88mm crankshaft, which ought to fit perfectly with those Manly Turbo Tough I-beam rods. This is made from 4340 billet, heat-treated, stress-relieved, shot-peened, nitrided, and balanced. It's magnafluxed and it features knife-edged counterweights and directional oiling. I'd say that this is a fair substitute for what we've got going on with the GSX's 6-bolt build. Complementary but different approaches. Do you agree? Let me know.
Pretty, isn't it? So this is going to commence the $1,300 test to see whether I can use this block or not. If that crank fits, I'm in good shape. If that crank doesn't fit and I can't make it fit, well, start over. And it should look pretty obvious by the look of things what's about to transpire here. For the past decade, you've seen me messing around on the inside of 6-bolt blocks. You've gotten used to what those look like. I just like to let you know that when we get inside the 7-bolt, things look a whole lot different. Windage tray, built-in bearing girdle. We'll see a whole bunch of stuff that looks new and what lies ahead. But for now, I'm going to save you the groaning and screaming of my air compressor as I clean this thing up and solicit a little bit of Rojo del Choco's help.
The flap's seen better days, but none of this was ever supposed to be here for this long. Whatever engine catastrophe you suffered, that catastrophe's the best engine preservative you could ever want. I simply added WD-40 to mine and shrink wrapped all the filth right in, and after this little cleanup, this is how it looks after 11 years in a non-climate controlled shed. Practically outside, except without all the rain. This is where we came from. My old main bearings were fine right up to the point where they weren't, but it's not their fault. It was the rod bearings. I did suffer a general oil system failure, but most of this damage was from the giblets of my rod bearings, which backfilled the crankshaft's oil galley with chunks as the rod journal methodically food processed my number 3 and 4 bearings. You know, the oil holes, they sort of have a scraping effect, and even before the oil system failed, chunks were getting embedded. I heard it fail, cut it off immediately, restarted it again, and drove it 2 miles home listening to what sounded like breaking glass inside of a cookie tin. That crankshaft is good and fragged, and I knew it would be. But again, it's not the main's fault. Plenty of abuse was dealt to it, but if I get lucky, that new crank will fit. I can't wait to find out, but I wasn't done with this thing. We got oil squirters to do. Each main bearing oil journal has an asshole that squirts up into the piston dome. We're going to tear the old ones out and give it some new ones. This oil is for cooling the burn, not for lubrication. There's much conjecture regarding clogged oil squirters and crank walk because they share their oil supplies from the same main journal. If it clogs, really, you're going to lose cooling. If one clogs, nothing's going to happen to your oiling on that journal or the rods or any of the other journals. All that's going to happen is perhaps you're going to get a tiny little teeny bump in oil pressure across every single oil journal in the engine. But that's only if the other 150 other places that are leaking oil on the inside of the crankcase don't already have room to leak that extra little pinhole's worth of pressure, which I'll bet you they do. All you're going to lose is cooling the piston dome. These have nothing to do with crank walk, and if these were the decider in your engine failure, then your oil pump was already gone to begin with. Speaking of which, my oil gallery modification was only good enough this time, and I threw caution to the wind. No safety. No more rough stuff or sharp edges though, but I've done a better job before. This is just all you'd need to do. No sharp anything. Yeah, for the squirters, no crush washers, no torque wrench, no dowel pins, no careful clearancing of piston skirts, no aiming them. You just knock them out with some light taps from a hammer using a long punch. No need to get fancy. You buy new ones and replace them, that's what you do. They're $20 a piece, a small fraction of the price of the 1G assemblies. I do not recommend removing these things from your engine, but you know, if you did, you'd have to fashion some kind of oil squirter sized plug for that hole. Brass, probably. The turbo car needs the extra piston dome cooling in my opinion, and sorry to beat a dead horse again, but there's another superstition of check valves getting stuck open without a restriction and causing a drop in pressure on that one main journal. Basically, a check valve failure. I wish to assure you that I've run the math and put all of it in the description. I calculated the areas of the squirter, the main journal, the rod journal, and the galley that supplies all 3 of them. And if you still believe oil squirters have any effect on crank walk at all, I suggest that you visit the description. It's my fact-based opinion. But let's have an objective conversation about it, because all of you know that I care about oil systems. Crank walk isn't just for DSMs, and I think that it's important to dispel some rumors about its cause. The mineral spirits bath does leave residue, so even though you just watched me clean all the old rod bearing dust and oil and funk out, I still need to scrub these oil squirter holes and mains down with carb cleaner. And you can even see them change color as they give up their remaining dirt. I lost a few clips of installing the bearings in the 7-bolt girdle and of the first 2/3 of the torque procedure to operator error. But I caught it before the last third, and my loss is your gain. It saved you some time. You saw it once already, you get it. I still have the original ARP main studs from the original 7-bolt build. Cleaned them up, relubed them all again for proper torque procedure, and these are the same ones that you'd use on a 6-bolt. Same part number, 6 or 7 bolt. These didn't change at all. They're 10mm studs on both. The girdle is what's different. I'm just doing the same first preliminary check that we did with the Galant crank earlier in the video. This is the big how you doing, the visual answer that you can quickly see without all the math that I'm still going to give to you anyway, but it establishes my GSX's original 7-bolt block's place in this lineup. What isn't there to like about this video? Like about this video. Like this video. Hit the like button on this video. You like the like button on this video. You like to hit the like button on this video. Here we go. Number 5 looks like... Oh, no, you didn't, Jaffro. You did. It's 2000s. Maybe a little shy of the mark, meaning it's slightly bigger, but it's closer to 2 than it is 3. Blocking all the other ones too? Come on. You'll have to take my word for it. You're barely going to see any of this. I'm sorry. Most all of them look like 2000s, and finally you can start to see it. Sorry for that. The very next thing I did was clean all of this back up, and it all ended up on the same memory card to be imported and discovered only in the edits. Because clearly I suck at making videos. Being that I got 2000s on everything, that 2000s is the tightest part of the red plastic gauge scale. And how it got crushed mercilessly to the point of disintegration, I quickly realized I probably should have done a green plastic gauge test on that one because it only measures from 1 to 3 thousandths oil clearance. It would have given me much more specific information. This crank is bigger than all of my other ones because all my other ones are either used or made by Eagle. So of course, I'll let the bore gauge tell all in this case. However, if all I relied on was a plastic gauge test, that one told me that unless this crank doesn't fit its own manufacturer's rods, then this combination of crank and block already works, just like it sits. We all know that it still needs oil squirters, which I almost regret not installing now after all how positive all this has looked. I'm all like, where's my assembly lube? I feel like we've been a little bit overdue here for a big win like this. I don't know. Here's the numbers. Overall, this looks amazing to me. You can see there's 1.5 thou worth of run out on number 1 and number 4, but we've got a bore with enough meat on it to hit my goals with just a very light line hone and do no harm to my oil clearance goals for this one and how it'll be used. After so many years of chasing a straight bore on a 6-bolt, I'm overjoyed to see this, especially after what this one's already been through. And most highest especially to me because this is the numbers matching GSX block. Here's the factory 7-bolt crankshaft, and you can see that it weighs in at an even 30 pounds. Here's the Manly unit, still qualifying for the same weight class, but with an extra pound in all the right places. I've already acquired all the parts that you watched me destroy for both of these engines, as well as a few extras. Of course, the dowels and the dowel pins for everything else, as well as another valve cover gasket set with an aluminum seal that I got to polish and a shiny new motor mount bolt. And I also picked up a new windage tray just because I could. It'll look nice on video, a lot better than the one I haven't cleaned yet. And I suppose if it comes clean, I'll have a spare one if I keep it oiled. You don't need to see me clean this stuff, but oh hey, here's that thing I was looking for earlier. This is Miller Tool Company MD998371. It's the front bearing puller for the dry shaft. It works just like the other one, except it uses a crow's foot base rather than a plate to brace against the block. You just insert it, turn the foot, snug it down, grab your 22mm wrench and honk it out just like the other one. Looks like it's never even been used. On the dry shaft, you remove the front bearing first, so that the same tool that we used earlier fits inside the bore to pull the rear bearing. The rear bearings on both balance shafts are the same diameter, but they're different part numbers because one has an oil hole and one doesn't. The front bearing is 1 millimeter larger than the rear bearings, and also why it has its own tool. I bought my bearing pullers in the used market because they're not making new ones. It just became apparent to me that the washer on this one isn't the original washer. I came up about 1 millimeter short of being able to get the balance shaft bearing out of the hole before I ran out of threads. It's not supposed to happen. I'll replace it or add a washer to it, no big deal. This balance shaft bearing looks brand new too. I know, it wasn't funny the first time. The reason you pull these bearings out even though you don't have balance shafts is so that you can clean the oil galleys out that supply them. You don't want any hidden surprises. I can't believe I waited 11 years to do this. It was an expensive test. I told you back then that it didn't crank walk. I've just been chasing that 6-bolt dragon relentlessly ever since. I want you to know that I'm still raising up all of those dragons and teaching them all to chooch. With all of these parts and blocks, what choice do I really have? They're all going to be every bit as spectacular as this one's going to be, and we got to use some cool factory tools today, look at some different scenery around here, and now we know what these last 2 engine blocks need before they go out the door. The Galant needs a smaller hole, which might get accomplished with a bigger one, and the 7-bolt GSX's hole is just fine. We can all work with it. Looks like I'll be covering the 6-bolt 1Gs and the 7-bolt 2G stuff again going forward after all. There's a few more really expensive parts left to round it all out now that I've got it figured out, but the last one into an engine bay is a rotten egg. Which one's it going to be? Stay tuned!